Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Ethan Hecht, and I'm the Executive Director of the Colorado MahlerFest. I am extremely excited to hear this first talk. Our first presenter helped lead our guided hike yesterday, and if you didn't get to go, we're hoping we can do 2 of them next year because we can only fit so many people in a hike, and I have heard nothing but wonderful things about the words of wisdom she had to contribute. So let me introduce to you Kalanit Liat Chalstrom.
Thank you. Good morning. Can everybody hear me okay? Excellent. My name, as Ethan said, is Kalanit Liat Chalstrom. My research on Gustav Mahler explores Mahler's connection to his Jewish identity. In my master's thesis, I explored how Leonard Bernstein self-identified with the Mahler legacy in his 1960 Young People's Concert Series, which we'll have an opportunity to look at today. And in doing so, helped to facilitate the Mahler Revival of the 1960s that changed current perspectives of Mahler and his music. I have also done a little bit of work on Mahler's relationship with Richard Wagner's music and how the impact of Wagner's relationship and his insidious ideas regarding Jewish music shaped Mahler's experiences throughout his career. I currently work in 20th century Jewish American music research, particularly the music of Aaron Copland and Leonard Bernstein. And when I'm not studying Mahler, Copland, or Bernstein, I'm studying American punk and metal as they relate to building community and musical nostalgia. So I like to get my hands on a lot of different things, but I am extremely excited today to talk to you all about Gustav Mahler. So let's begin with a very deceptively simple question. Who is Gustav Mahler? Of course, there are facts that many of us know about Gustav Mahler. He was born in Kaliszta, Bohemia, as the second of 14 children in a Jewish family. The family moved to Iglau, or Jihlava, in 1860, just after Mahler was born. His parents were Bernard Mahler, who was an alcohol trader, and Marie Mahler-Ehrmann. Another fact that you may be familiar with is that Mahler converted from Judaism to Catholicism in the late 1890s. Now, we're going to take a little bit of a closer look at what exactly that meant. In the late 1890s, Mahler, who had been working his way up in the conducting world, moving from city to city for better opportunities, found himself at the perspective of a job of a lifetime, the Vienna court opera director. But Mahler simply was not allowed to hold this position as a Jew. He remarked as much in a letter to Arnold Berliner in January of 1897. Mahler writes, "I have not yet found another post. I have had a succession of offers from Munich, Vienna, etc., but everywhere the fact that I am a Jew has, at the last moment, proved a block over which the contracting party has stumbled." Mahler also wrote to Udun von Mihalovic, a Hungarian musician, in December of 1896 about the Vienna position in particular. He writes, "At the moment, I am high on the list of candidates, but 2 factors are against me, it seems. My madness, which my enemies mention whenever they want to put difficulties in my path, and the fact that I was born a Jew. As regards this point, I must tell you, in case you don't know it yet, that I was converted to Catholicism very shortly after I left Budapest." As scholars have explored, Mahler was actually falsifying the record of his conversion here. Mahler converted in February of 1897, almost 6 full years after leaving Budapest. In another letter to Ludwig Karpath, undated but presumed to be sometime after this conversion, Mahler states, "I had myself baptized only when the Vienna position beckoned. I had been baptized years before that, but the fact is that the desire to escape from Pollini's Hamburg inferno awakened in me the idea of leaving the Jewish religious community." Bernard Pollini was an impresario in Hamburg that had a very, shall we say, difficult relationship with Gustav Mahler. They were not the best of friends, and it ended up creating a lot of tensions, among other things in Vienna, which we will shortly explore. Now, what these particular letters help us to highlight is an important aspect of our forthcoming discussion. Part of Mahler's story, a rather necessary part that is often overlooked in many contexts, is Mahler's complex relationship with his Jewishness and how that may have affected or been reflected in his experiences and his musical output. Our purpose here today is not to quantify Mahler's Jewishness or answer the question of how Jewish Mahler was definitively. Rather, it is to set some reasonable terms to think about that question in order to help shape our understanding of how complex Mahler was as a Jewish composer. I conclude that Mahler can and should contextually be understood as Jewish, but not because his conversion, wasn't authentic in any way. Rather, I present that understanding Mahler as Jewish can help us to discuss the complexity of Mahler's experiences. Now, before we continue, I'd like to take a moment to discuss Jewishness as a concept in music research. It's a very complicated subject. Do we call music Jewish because a Jewish composer wrote it? That is certainly one way of looking at it. So all of Mahler's music is in some way Jewish if we look at it from that particular perspective. But can we point out specific elements of Mahler's music as having Jewish origins? Maybe. And that's where Jewish music research becomes particularly nuanced. Identifying the Jewish elements in the works of Jewish composers is our current battle with the musicological landscape. As the musicologist Ralph Locke states, Jewish music is subject to cultural multiplicity, complexity, and hybridity. While it is certainly tempting to identify clear so-called Jewish elements within a Jewish composer's non-Jewish-centric piece, the reality is that Jewish composers, like all composers, respond, adapt, and connect to their environments in nuanced ways that suggest constant stylistic blending between Jewish cultural elements and non-Jewish cultural elements, rather than rigid separation. Furthermore, Jewishness is a spectrum of experiences. Historically, it has been viewed as a religion, a nationality, and an ethnicity, sometimes separately, sometimes all at the same time. This makes engaging with a Jewish composer and their music particularly complex. We might do well to ask ourselves a series of questions. How did the composer engage with their own identity? In what ways was Jewishness engaged with on a cultural level? On a social and political level? What aspects of non-Jewish culture may have influenced the Jewish composer's experiences, either through assimilation, which can be benign or insidious, or through cultural fusion? In the case of Gustav Mahler, we know for certain that he was born Jewish, and he had a sense of self-assigned Jewish identity throughout his life. But some of that sense of Mahler's Jewish identity may be due in part to the continued association of Mahler with conceptions of Jewish artistry, in critical writings on his music, sometimes in quite negative ways, even after his conversion. We also know that the Austro-German society during Mahler's lifetime was a very complex social political landscape, and Mahler's Vienna was highly anti-Semitic. I don't want to give too much away yet because we're going to explore this as we go forth, but Jewish identity was viewed by non-Jews as both a religion and as a racial characteristic. Furthermore, we know that Mahler's Catholicism raises further questions about assimilation. And Mahler never really wrote what we would typically say is Jewish music today. Of course, there is so-called klezmer passages in the third movement of the First Symphony. Even though they clearly sound Jewish to our modern ears, they have very complex origins and can't securely be defined as Jewish because of those origins. So Mahler's Jewish identity is inherently complex, but Mahler was closely connected to that identity, and his music was subject to intense scrutiny because of his Jewish background. This multiplicity, complexity, and hybridity of Mahler's identity is our main focus for engaging with Mahler as specifically Jewish, allowing for a deeper look at how his Jewishness impacted his critical reception. Today we're going to explore Mahler as a specifically Jewish composer by way of 3 periods of his reception: Mahler's early critical reception in Vienna, his reception after his death during the Mahler Revival of the 1960s, and his reception today. We will take a close look at anti-Semitic troping, the making of the Mahler mythology, and current conceptions of Mahler, to gain a better understanding of the composer. In doing so, we will better understand what it may have meant to be Jewish for Mahler, and how ideas about his Jewishness shaped the reception of his music during and after his career. We will also discover new ways to look at Mahler as specifically Jewish individual, which allow for us to understand and discuss the complexity of Mahler's experiences. Which brings us to our first section today, which is Mahler's early critical reception. Now, his early critical reception in Vienna laid the foundation for his reception after his death. In Vienna, Mahler obtained that critical, coveted court opera position. You'll recall that Mahler likely converted to obtain this position. We're now going to take a look at how perceptions of Mahler as Jewish, despite this conversion, played a large role in his critical reception. By the time of his conversion in 1897, Mahler was well used to being received by critics and audiences in a very negative way. In a letter penned to Ludwig Karpath on April 11th of 1897, Mahler sheds light on time leading up to taking this role as director of the Vienna Court Opera. He writes here, "Confound it, I have just heard of Bezegny's resignation." Bezegny was the general administrator at the Vienna Court Opera. "It has come too soon. This actually was the serious crisis at which I hinted to you, by which my appointment, already decided on by Prince Liechtenstein, was so suddenly and unexpectedly delayed. I wonder whether the anti-Semitic papers will not make capital out of this, by implying, for instance, that my engagement forced him to go. That is something that we should anticipate and prevent." The anti-Semitic papers that Mahler alluded to in April of 1897, continued to plague him once he officially took his post in May of that year. Full disclosure, we're going to look at mostly negative criticism here to kind of prove our point. Mahler had some good reception in Vienna through a couple friendly reviewers, but it turned poorly rather quickly, and we're going to look at a review from a friendly reviewer that it does have anti-Semitic undertones. We're going to take a look at that and kind of explore what that means. Here are a few selections as quoted in Edward F. Kravitz's article on the new anti-Semitism surrounding Mahler and the Vienna position. I've highlighted a few key words and phrases that I'd want us to pay close attention to. First, from an article in Deutsche Zeitung that details how Mahler and his music were seen as distinctly different from Germans, and even shameful because of this distinction, as well as Mahler's willingness to push boundaries that constituted German identity in music. This review says, "You shamed us all. You ignored your own ban on solo performances at Philharmonic concerts for your own advantage, to allow your orchestrated Lieder, blessed master of the German Lied, forgive us for calling them Lieder, to follow and identify them as Volkslieder. A pardon, hallowed German folk, for this insult that affronted you." Kravitz also explores this quote from a friendly critic to Mahler, a man named Niemann, that Mahler expressed the, quote, "scandalous Semitic race too strongly. Jewish blood flows through Mahler's creativity." Additionally, Henry A. Lea explores the way critics interacted with Mahler in Vienna on a broader scale. On the day before his first Philharmonic concert, Mahler was denounced as the, quote, "Jewish musical dictator of Vienna," in a newspaper article. In 1901, he was displaced as the orchestra's conductor by the anti-Semitic Josef Helmsberger. Mahler was accused of being overzealous, presumptuous, and tyrannical, of abusing his musicians, not choosing the right repertoire, tampering with the classics, favoring friends and relatives, getting rid of respected artists, and in one case, even financial irregularities. What Kravitz and Lea point out so clearly for us is anti-Semitic troping and criticism of Mahler's music. Anti-Semitic troping is the use of anti-Semitic stereotypes in literature, art, or cultural contexts to such an extent that it becomes a recognizable theme. When we talk about anti-Semitic troping during this period, specifically as it relates to Mahler's music, we need to turn back to one key musical figure that may or may not surprise you, Richard Wagner. Wagner wrote a treatise in 1850, which was anonymous, and then republished in 1869 under his own name, called Das Judentum in der Musik, Judaism in Music. To put it quite simply, Wagner didn't believe that Jewish individuals were capable of originality in music, nor did he particularly believe in their humanity. These are not easy passages that I am about to show you. They're not easy to engage with. We're looking at them so we can understand the kind of anti-Semitic troping that was common in music criticism, especially that was perpetuated by musicians in power like Wagner. That which the lords of the Roman and medieval world extracted from their bondmen in torment and suffering, that nowadays the Jew converts from day to day into gold. Who is there to recognize the strips of paper of innocent appearance as having the blood of numberless generations sticking to them? That which the heroes of art during 2,000 unblessed years, and with untold efforts as exhaustive to life as destructive of human joy, succeed in wringing from the demon art foe, that nowadays the Jew converts into a mere article of exchange. Here Wagner asserts a key anti-Semitic trope among several others: unoriginality by a process of what he calls conversion. That is, the taking of what Wagner considers to be pure and reproducing it, therefore depurifying it. He echoes this several times. Wagner goes on to attack physical characteristics, including speech, which he specifically relates to music and this idea of originality. The speech of the Jew is, however, of even greater importance, considering that is, in relation to its effect upon us, an effect which constitutes the essential feature to dwell upon in referring to Jewish influence upon music. The Jew converses in the tongue of the people amongst whom he dwells from age to age, but he does this invariably after the manner of a foreigner. And again, assuming the Jew to feel a desire to express himself in art, the substance of what he had to say could only be of this latter indifferent and trivial kind. And that for the reason that his entire incentive in an art direction originated unnecessarily and merely in the pursuit of luxury. Throughout his treatise, Wagner asserts, among other things, that there really is no Jewish art, and that it is all practically derivative of what he believes to be the pure, that is, true European styles. But where in the world was all of this coming from? The late 19th century saw a shift in anti-Semitic troping that made it more covert. In 1867 in Austria and 1869 in Prussia, respectively, Jews were legally fully emancipated. This was preceded by what Edward F. Kravitz explores as a fairly liberal period in the German-speaking empire, where Jews found themselves in places previously barred to them, such as education. Yet this period of relative expansionism, if one could call it that, led to race-based anti-Semitism, which saw Jews as a separate, inferior race, with roots in German nationalism. That's how, according to Kravitz, we get things like Wagner's treatise. Wagner wrote this treatise in the socio-political lead-up to the emancipation. Wagner was vehemently opposed to the emancipation and, in his essay, attacks it as a fallacy that led the non-Jewish majority to what he very nebulously describes as a forced reckoning of their feelings of distaste with the Jews. Other anti-Semitic tropes that are harder to pin down, but are part of a larger cultural context of anti-Semitic troping, are Jews as extreme in their mannerisms, unstable, neurotic, vacillating, etc., and defining that as inherently wrong in comparison to the refined purity of native Germans. Wagner states this, though unclearly, throughout the opening sections of his treatise. Now, I know this is really not a fun thing to ask of you guys, but please keep these specific traits in mind as we go forth. Okay, so what does this mean for Mahler? This kind of criticism can change shape and become separated from their anti-Semitic roots. So it's not necessary to understand them as always inherently anti-Semitic, but we can inform educated opinions on what criticisms may have been rooted in these tropes based on the writer's possible engagement with treatises like Wagner's and responses to those criticisms in the early 20th century, specifically after Mahler's death. To do this, we're going to leap a little bit ahead into the 20th century and consider a range of figures who shaped Mahler's legacy. One such is one who you may be familiar with, Aaron Copland, who was a very staunch supporter of Mahler. In fact, Copland, who was Jewish, and he was one of Mahler's early advocates in the United States. In 1925, Copland remarked in frustration in a letter to the New York Times that, quote, "The music critics of New York City are agreed upon in at least one point: Gustav Mahler as a composer is hopeless. Year in and year out, the performance of one of Mahler's works is invariably accompanied by the same disparaging reviews." And you're probably thinking to yourself, now that doesn't sound like support of Mahler. It gets better. He also seems to acknowledge a sense of unoriginality that was threaded in Mahler criticisms, specifically as it related to Mahler as a romantic composer. If one discounts, for the moment, banal themes, the old-fashioned, romantical, philosophical conceptions so dear to Mahler, if one looks at the music qua music, then it is undeniable that Mahler is a composer of today. The Second Symphony, which dates from 1894, is 30 years ahead of its time. From the standpoint of orchestration, Mahler is head and shoulders above Strauss, whose orchestral methods have already dated so perceptibly. Here, Copland situates Mahler as ahead of his time, and therefore undeniably original in his work, specifically in terms of his modern orchestration, as opposed to his overall romantic sensibility. Another Mahler advocate from the early 20th century was Bruno Walter. In addition to an illustrious career in which he conducted Mahler's music frequently, Walter, who assisted Mahler in Vienna and led the premieres of both Das Lied and the Ninth, was also Jewish. He published the monograph of Gustav Mahler in 1936. Although Walter's book does not include any specific mention of Mahler as Jewish, he does seem to argue, indirectly, against the previous anti-Semitic caricatures of Mahler's personality, namely his supposedly vacillating and unstable mentality. He writes, "And yet it would be fundamentally wrong to think of him as vacillating and unstable. While he was not constant, the direction in which he pointed was firmly fixed, and no impulse was able to swerve him from it. Neither ought he by any means to be called unhappy, for he who had been given so rich a substance, so warm a heart, and so eloquent a tongue, cannot be classified among either the happy or the unhappy." Now remember when I asked you to keep those really terrible concepts of vacillating and unstable and neurotic in mind? Well, here is a variation of that in Walter's response. As you can see, anti-Semitic troping became threaded into the way Mahler was critically received both during his life and shortly after. Things, fortunately, didn't stay like this forever after Mahler's death. In the 1960s, Mahler's music had a large boom of recognition and popularity that is typically referred to as a Mahler Revival, and largely credited to Leonard Bernstein in 1960 in the United States. But any Mahler Revival actually started long before 1960. With more time, we discuss many of the key players in this Mahler Revival, but here are a few. The first two have already been mentioned: Bruno Walter, who had firsthand knowledge of the type of anti-Semitic vitriol Mahler experienced both during his life and after; Aaron Copland, who we also just discussed, and a lifelong admirer of Mahler, both of whom were Jewish; Oscar Freed, who was also Jewish, and a very prolific Mahler advocate. Freed was the first to record any of Mahler's works in 1923 or 1924 with Mahler's Symphony No. 2. In addition, Freed programmed, performed, and continued to record Mahler's works throughout his career. Wilhelm Mengelberg, who was Mahler's friend and an avid supporter. Mengelberg was decidedly not Jewish, but he was the leader of the Royal Concertgebouw Orchestra in Amsterdam and the New York Philharmonic, and he frequently performed Mahler's music. But Mengelberg serves as a little bit of control here. He should not be seen as a supporter of Jewish causes, and he would demonstrate this later in his career through his nebulous support of the Nazi Party. It is true, though, that Leonard Bernstein was probably one of Mahler's most prominent supporters, and Jewish at that. He hosted a young people's concert in 1960 centered specifically on Gustav Mahler. Bernstein had a very deep relationship with Gustav Mahler and his music, despite the fact that the two, of course, never met, with Bernstein having been born 7 years after Mahler's death. It's really not clear how much Bernstein knew of the details of Mahler's Jewish identity, but nonetheless, the parallels between the two composers are rather tantalizing. Like Mahler, Bernstein was no stranger to being asked to adjust his identity to assimilate into society. Bernstein was apparently asked to distance himself from his Jewishness by way of a name change to something, quote, less ethnic sounding by Sergei Koussevitzky, the name that Koussevitzky asked him to change it to, Leonard S. Burns. Koussevitzky, Bernstein's beloved teacher and friend, was also Jewish, but like Mahler, converted to Christianity. Bernstein said, absolutely not. If I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this as Leonard Bernstein, and we know him as Leonard Bernstein today. Bernstein, like Gustav Mahler, faced questions about assimilation through this potential name change, albeit in a very different and less bitterly anti-Semitic environment than Vienna at the turn of the century. In addition, Bernstein's critical reception throughout his career and even after his death includes several echoes of anti-Semitic tropes that relate to criticisms of Mahler. Now, that is not to say that Bernstein's more recent critics were at all engaging consciously with anti-Semitism in any way. Rather, criticism of Bernstein's music has, at times, resembled these tropes, particularly around a certain composition. Much of the criticism around Bernstein's work has revolved around his 1971 stage production of Mass. After the premiere of the work, Harold C. Schoenberg touched on the compositional elements of Bernstein's Mass as hardly original. But in his more serious music, Bernstein has tended to sound derivative. The serious music content is pretentious and thin. It is a pseudo-serious effort that basically is, I think, cheap and vulgar. Again, those anti-Semitic tropes do become distant and divorced from their anti-Semitic origins, but the echoes of those criticisms do create parallels between Mahler and Bernstein.
Was Schoenberg Jewish?
Schoenberg was Jewish, yes. Bernstein, who personally identified on some level with Mahler, likely because of their shared Jewish background, and definitely because of parallels between their careers as composers and conductors, built up the Mahler mythology through the idea of Mahler as a double man. Not an idea that Bernstein invented. Copland and others did have versions of this, but one that Bernstein absolutely ran with. The double man is how Bernstein makes sense of several of Mahler's perceived dichotomies, that of the composer versus the conductor, the romantic versus the modern music, and the chamber versus the operatic writing in the symphonies. Another double theory that Bernstein presents situates Mahler's Jewish feelings against his Catholic ones, which is particularly revealing. In the script of A Young People's Concert, Bernstein actually cut out this portion regarding Mahler's Jewishness. Let's take a little bit of a closer look at that script. Bernstein explains the struggle between composer and conductor using the term double man to describe the problem that he and Mahler both faced on account of being both. I'm going to let Bernstein take it over from here.
It's a problem to be both a conductor and a composer. And there seems to be enough time and energy to be both things. I ought to know because I have the same problem myself. And that's one of the reasons why I'm so sympathetic to Mahler. I understand his problem. It's like being two different men locked up in the same body. One man is a conductor and the other is a composer, and they're both one fellow called Mahler or Bernstein. It's like being a double man. But with him, with Mahler, the problem was much worse even. He was a double man in every single part of his musical life. And today we're going to try and get a picture in our minds of this double man by listening to his music and discovering how the battle between those two different Mahlers inside him made his music come out sounding new.
The original way that it does is how that sentence ends. Bernstein remarks that with Mahler, the problem was much worse. And he situates this battle context, and you'll notice that he ends that with sounding the original way that it does. I bet some of your ears are perking up here. Bernstein very clearly asserts that Mahler's music is original, which shows he was engaging in some way, whether unconsciously or not, with the anti-Semitic troping that we discussed earlier. Continuing to build on the concept of the double Mahler theory, Bernstein also frames the contrasts that he perceives in Mahler's music as a battle pretty consistently.
Feelings are extreme, exaggerated, like young people's feelings. That's another reason why it's especially right to have you, young people, come to this birthday celebration. I think young people can understand Mahler's feelings even better than old ones. Once you understand that secret of his music, the voice of the child, you can really love his music. So that's the main secret about him. He was struggling all his life to recapture those pure, unmixed, overflowing emotions of childhood. I'm sure you've all had emotions like that filled up feeling that nature sometimes makes you have, especially in the spring where you almost want to cry because everything is so beautiful. Well, Mahler's music is full of those feelings and full of the sounds of nature, like bird calls and hunting horns and forest murmurs, which are all part of his idea of beauty, childlike beauty. He was this grown-up, very sophisticated, learned man with children of his own and a heart full of struggles between the different voices fighting inside him, always trying to feel pure and innocent again like a child. And that, too, is another one of the battles he had. The battle of the double man, half child. And we're going to play for you now.
By framing the double Mahler theory as a battle, Bernstein has raised the stakes of analyzing Mahler's music. In this perceived battle, Bernstein implies that there is a constant back and forth between two opposing Mahlers, one of which must emerge triumphant. This might sound a little bit familiar if you're also familiar with Beethoven's heroic period, with the idea of musical triumph over his deafness. Now, page 16 is a little bit different from the previous pages, and that Bernstein has annotated this page in his unmistakable script with both pencil and blue pen, creating a box around a particular segment of the script and then completely crossing it out. The struck box continues through page 19 and contains the following. For instance, he was born into a Jewish family, and yet when he grew up, he became a firm believer in the Christian religion. But always throughout his life, he carried that struggle with him between his Jewish feelings and his Christian ones. And again, both feelings show up in his music. On the one hand, he is always using chorale tunes from the Christian church. Then, on the other, you will hear lots of passages, like this one from his first symphony, that have the flavor of a band playing at a Jewish wedding. It's almost impossible to believe that both of these pieces are written by the same composer. But there you are. This composer was always two composers at the same time. Now, Bernstein states that Mahler was a firm believer in the Christian religion. Of course, there is direct evidence that this was not the case, or at least not the whole truth of it, as Mahler specifically converted in order to obtain the position at the Vienna Court Opera. Bernstein's use of the word firm contradicts this reality and erases a large part of Mahler's Jewish identity. However, this section does contain the beginnings of a nuanced discussion around Mahler as a Jewish man who was forced to assume another role in order to survive. He simplifies this idea into Mahler's Jewish feelings and his Christian ones, creating a basis by which to begin an exploration of Mahler's relationship to his religion, while also creating space for the fact that Mahler may have indeed had a desire to be, in some way, engaged with Christianity, or to even be Christian, as writers who have been thought to influence Bernstein, such as Kurt List in the Jewish periodical commentary, explored in the mid-century. Now, by framing Mahler as fighting an internal battle, Bernstein builds up this mythology for which Jewishness is a central component. Whether it's about wars in space or about reframing of historical events, we like to engage with the idea of battles as a way of negotiating who we are, particularly in light of forces that are in tension with each other. Although his Mahler repertoire was pretty limited before 1960, Bernstein went on to engage deeply with Mahler's music, especially over that next decade. Bernstein is even reportedly buried with a copy of Mahler's Fifth Symphony, opened to the Adagietto, which was his favorite movement. Now, we've come quite a long way. Mahler's biography, his early criticisms as it relates to anti-Semitic troping, and the Mahler Revival of the 1960s. Which brings us back to the here and now, our own time today. And that leads us to a big question. How do we think about Gustav Mahler today? Mahler and his music are engaged with on a significantly different level than they were in the late 1890s, but still contain some echoes of that early critical reception, particularly Bernstein's idea of the inner battle within Mahler, and Mahler's music as neurotic or unstable. Now, I want to be very clear about this. This is in no way to suggest that we should read recent criticisms of Mahler's music as anti-Semitic, should they frame Mahler's music in terms that have anti-Semitic roots, such as instability or neuroticism. Rather, we should identify how these elements of Mahler's early criticisms have both become separated from their anti-Semitic context and influenced our perceptions of Mahler today. Let's take a look at a few examples from the late 20th and early 21st centuries. We'll start with Bernstein's Battle. Our first is a review of Pierre Boulez's Mahler recording. Mahler's inner battle Mahler's inner battle that Bernstein has popularized is turned right on its head in this David Schiff review. He says, "The anguished Mahler we have come to admire is morose, obsessive, hypersensitive, darkly prophetic, as Leonard Bernstein claimed of all the horrors of this century. But there is another Mahler, affirmative, Austrian, Christian. Pierre Boulez's revisionist new reading may rescue it, Symphony 8, from its bad reputation, but only if listeners are ready to reimagine Mahler's personality and his world." This review is from 1996. Here, the hopeful side of Mahler is directly associated with his Christianity, and the review does not mention Mahler as Jewish. This is not at all to suggest that Schiff, who is Jewish and has explored Jewish topics in deeply profound ways in his own music, is repeating anti-Semitic tropes. Rather, it is to point out how ways of thinking about Mahler in terms of these oppositions in Mahler between a neurotically Jewish, though Schiff doesn't specifically refer to Mahler as Jewish, and the redemptive Christian side, which Schiff does mention, have become ingrained in the criticisms of Mahler even through the late 20th century. Again, to echo Bernstein, the Jewish feelings versus the Christian ones. Another review that situates Mahler as a triumphantly tortured figure while continuously framing his music as a sonic battle between dark and light and beautiful bursting sound comes from the WTTW review of the Chicago Symphony Orchestra's Mahler in April of 2025, written by Hedy Weiss, which tells us of a recent performance of Symphony No. 7. The highly dramatic and varied sounds to be heard throughout the symphony were of the essence, from the dark opening of the moments of the brass section to the tense but bold sound of the immense orchestra, and to moments of lyrical beauty, as well as bursts of sound from the timpani. High drama at one moment, lyrical beauty at the next. Huge bursts of sound from the brass or the timpani or the cymbals, and then moments of calm before the big sound built again at breathtakingly high speed. A third review is from 2009, and it's written by James Ostreich, focused on Mahler's Symphony No. 9. It states that loveliness in Mahler being a sometime thing. The brasses were equally impressive in moments of rasping sarcasm set against plush, sweet string textures in the first movement, and the strings themselves took on the necessary sarcasm at the start of the second. But any performance of Mahler's Ninth, having survived the first three movements, stands or falls on the finale with its wrenching harmonies and the heartbreaking dissolution of its ending. The battle framework here is being applied to Mahler's music in this critical review through a series of musical contrasts. The brass go head-to-head with the strings and melodic content. In addition, the wrenching harmonies and the heartbreaking dissolution that finish the piece are sonic indications of either a battle either lost or not yet won. There is also the potential to read musical sarcasm and musical sweetness as depictions of Jewish and non-Jewish characteristics respectively, where sweetness may be typically associated with musical purity, as we explored in Wagner's treatise. Sarcasm could possibly be read as an example of opposing Jewish traits. There's a lot of literature on how sarcasm relates to expressions of Jewish identity. There's a potential link there. It's not as strong as this musical contrast battle. Now we're going to take a look at instability and neuroticism. In this review from May of 2024 from the Washington Classical Review, Charles T. Downey articulates a common criticism of Mahler's music as neurotic. Again, this particular concept has been divorced from its anti-Semitic origin, but remains an excellent example of Mahler's early criticism being repeated in modern contexts. Tempos tended to be brusque, and the edges of the more neurotic mood shifts felt sharpened. While his interpretation of the seventh at times felt too rushed at a little under 80 minutes, Nozetta managed to make this odd assembly of incongruous ideas sound unified. This review from December of 2016 from the New York Classical Review, written by George Grella, is another example of instability and neuroticism as part of Mahler's modern critical reception, assigning the characteristics specifically to Mahler, the individual. Where the New Yorkers play Mahler with brittle, neurotic vivacity that seems to reflect Mahler himself, the Dutch orchestra seems to come out of the towns, cities, and mountains that comprised Mahler's personal geography. What do these examples tell us about how Mahler is received today? A few things, actually. One, Mahler's critical reception has shifted significantly into more positive territory. Two, his music is programmed and fairly often. You may have noticed that one of these reviews is from another Mahler festival. The end of the Chicago Symphony Orchestra review mentions the Amsterdam Mahler Festival. We, of course, are at the Colorado Mahler Festival right now. We are very lucky to be here today. The 38th festival, to be exact. That means that Mahler's music is important enough to our musical landscape to have annual festivals about. Kind of like the plethora of annual festivals that center around Bach, Mozart, Beethoven every single year. Additionally, a wide range of Mahler's works are performed, not just a select few from a particular era. In these alone, we looked at several different symphonies, including numbers 6, 7, 8, and 9. Our festival is, of course, focusing on the 6th. When you engage with a wider breadth of Mahler's criticisms today outside of our sample size, you will notice that the entirety of Mahler's symphonies are being programmed. You'll see a lot of 2, a lot of 4, a lot of 1, sometimes 3, not as often. But it's the whole breadth of the symphonies, which indicates to us that Mahler's music has stood the test of time, as it were, to our modern ears. And that also means that Mahler's music has been firmly established in our social conception of what we deem to be the Western classical canon. Another thing is that there is a fairly consistent framing of Mahler's music through the battle lens that Bernstein popularized in the 1960s. And using this binary, as we've seen through these reviews, sometimes oversimplifies the complexities of Mahler's experiences as it relates to his music. But something you'll notice that is missing in our small sample size. Mahler isn't commonly discussed as a Jewish composer. However, there are suggestions here to extremes of expression that in the past were associated with anti-Semitic troping, as we've explored in criticism, the explosions of energy, agitation, bursts of sound, high drama. But there is a larger sense in these reviews of Mahler as a successor to Beethoven in distinctly positive frameworks. We can see that direct anti-Semitic troping seems to disappear, but remnants might be argued to exist. Most reviews do not mention Mahler's identity outside of Austro-German. Other reviews seem to dance around the issue of Mahler as Jewish, preferring instead to assign him as Christian. While this is not inherently wrong, as Mahler did legitimately convert to Christianity, it does erase a large part of Mahler's Jewish history and the complexities regarding his Jewishness. That is not to say that modern critical reviews of Mahler's music as Jewish do not exist. Rather, it is to point out, through this sample size, that Mahler as Jewish is not a common discussion point. By understanding how Mahler was received as specifically a Jewish composer at the beginning of his career and after his death during the Mahler Revival, we can better understand that how we engage with Mahler today impacts his legacy. particularly in terms of Mahler's Jewishness and anti-Semitic troping. While Mahler may not have composed music that is traditionally and readily understood sonically as Jewish, he was still a Jewish composer who has been received as Jewish. By talking about Mahler as Jewish, we allow for the discussion of the complexity regarding Mahler's experiences. As you continue to engage with Mahler and his music throughout your lives, I encourage you to hold this nuance in mind. I hope you've come to look at him in new ways as a Jewish composer. Thank you very, very much for your attention today. I do believe we have a little bit of time for questions. So if anybody has any questions or comments, anything, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. When you talk about the instability and neuroticism that reviewers would associate with Mahler, I mean, like, wasn't Mozart considered a little unstable and neurotic, and other composers?
He was.
Does that get pointed out?
He was, but the association that there is with Mozart as unstable and neurotic is seen as genius, where with Mahler it was seen as Jewish, which was its own separate thing. You'll notice here, let me see if I can back up for you here. You'll notice in those slides on anti-Semitic troping, I actually put in, and I didn't draw a lot of attention to them, here they are. I put in some of these caricatures of Mahler. So here's one. It was a caricature reading the Jew Mahler as a scarecrow driving away our best singers. So Mahler's instability was seen in this way, whereas Mozart, he would have been seen as a genius. Another caricature refers to Mahler's rendition of Wagner's Ring Cycle. At our opera, Feuer and Wanton will look like this, which is, yeah. So yeah, it's that difference between the genius versus the negative Jewish stereotype. But yeah, awesome question. Thank you. Yeah.
So my question has to do, what do we really know about his emotional life? He himself makes a comment about madness. The reason that I ask about it is the following. I discovered Mahler sometimes in the 70s when I lived in Boston and went to concert at the Boston Symphony Orchestra. And what I fell in love was that instability, was the fact that his music was very emotional, but not sentimental.
Right.
Having grown up in a society that was suffused with anti-Semitism, just like he did,
Right.
if you want to be in both societies, your Jewish society, in your non-Jewish society, and especially if you want to accomplish something, you do become a little bit unstable and neurotic because your own Jewish identity, and that's something that most American Jews have not experienced, your own Jewish identity is held in such disdain.
Mm-hmm.
So can you say something, what do we really know about his emotional life before we had diagnosis of, depression, anxiety, and so on?
Right. Thank you for sharing. It is difficult to assign the emotional characteristics of historical figures when all we have is the letters. When Mahler refers to madness, he oftentimes is referring to what other people were ascribing as madness. So he's referring to these things like the caricatures that the newspapers were throwing on him. And Bruno Walter in his monograph was very clear that Mahler was very passionate. And I think a lot of times that passion was used as madness by anti-Semitic papers to push a certain agenda, shall we say. And I don't know, I hesitate to say too much on Mahler and his emotional standing because it's just so hard to know. But I do think that he was a very passionate individual from what we know, and that passion could be read as madness. Yeah?
So the last point you made about how modern criticism doesn't explicitly talk about Mahler's Jewishness all that much, is this something, again, when I read modern criticism, I don't see Jewishness in particular, but either religion or nationality exactly as a thing that is all that commonly centralized in thinking about any composer of the 20th century.
Right.
Are there counterexamples to that I'm not thinking of, or is this something that we're just kind of retreating from in a critical understanding of 20th century music?
I think there is an implied focus on Christianity a lot of the times, especially when you're talking about composers like Bach, who is writing a lot of chorales, Beethoven, who was of a specific religion, and I'm thinking of Bruckner right now, who did a lot of religious writing. So there is this implied sense of Christianity as the default. And so with somebody like Mahler, who has a really complex history and a really complex origin, where Jewishness played such a large role in how he was critically received, and how his music was made and also received, I do think it's important to try to make that distinction where it makes sense. You know, sometimes it doesn't always make sense to make that distinction, but yeah, does that make sense? Okay, does that answer the question a little bit?
I'm actually hoping more for someone who was Jewish.
Who was Jewish?
Who we critically think of as, okay, that's really important to their project.
Right, Leonard Bernstein is one that we think of a lot. Philip Glass, often his identity is often brought up a lot. Ernest Bloch is somebody whose identity gets brought up a lot. Aaron Copland, his Jewishness is often assigned to, which is really interesting because he distanced himself pretty far, which is its own conference talk. But so yeah, there are a lot of Jewish individuals where people will say this composer was Jewish, but for some reason Mahler is not always lumped in there. I think I saw your hand first. We'll do 1, 2, 3.
Okay. I've always thought of Mahler's conversion as primarily opportunistic.
Right.
And even his use of a text like it's Klopstock in the Second Symphony, right? Where, he takes a devotional text, but you could write about death and resurrection without being explicitly Christian. And my feeling about the Second Symphony, for example, is that the Christ part of it is somewhat left at the curb in order to address themes of death and resurrection that might not be explicitly Christian, but sound that way. And I wonder if that was your sense too, or do you have a different reading of all that?
So I tend to take kind of a centralist approach to this because I think that identity can be very complex. And because Mahler was in the society that he was in, which is a predominantly Christian society, I do think that reading the Resurrection Symphony with a very strong subtext of Christianity makes a lot of sense, but I do think not reading it that way also makes a lot of sense. That's kind of the beauty with Mahler in a way, is that there's a way to read his music in multiple different ways. And I think that you kind of have to take it from multiple different levels. You have to look at Mahler, the individual, as a Jewish man who converted to Christianity, who may or may not have followed the Christian religion in a specific way. Then you have to look at the social landscape, the political landscape, and kind of go down it.
I mean, I agree with everything you just said, and I view it the same way too. I just wondered if in your deep study of Mahler, do you get the sense that Mahler believed in the resurrection of Christ, for example?
I don't know. I can't get a good read. I cannot get a good read on it. I've spent a lot of time with it, and I just truly can't. You don't? You don't, yeah. I can't get a good read on it. Some days I do, and some days I don't. It's a weird one.
One thing I think should be considered, especially when you get to the point of the Third Reich, is that there were composers who were falsely accused of being Jewish.
Yep.
One of those was Max Bruch, who was decidedly not Jewish.
Yep.
But he wrote a popular piece called Holy Dry for cello and orchestra, and the Nazis were suspicious, and Max Bruch, possible Jew. And because of that, possible Jew. Because of that, his music was kind of suppressed during that time, and he may not be as well remembered a composer as he deserves to be, simply because of that, because he wrote one piece with Jewish connections, and the Nazis labeled him a possible Jew. He very much was not one.
Right.
And I think there are probably some other examples too.
Oh, certainly, yeah. That is another very difficult period in history for sure. Quinn, did you have and then we'll go.
I was just going to ask, what do you make of the association between Mahler's music and the
I think that Mahler had a lot of death in his life. He was from a family of 14 and lost most of his siblings, and he lost children. He was from an area that was surrounded by death a lot, and in Jewish culture, death, I am also Jewish, by the way, in Jewish culture, death is ritualized in a very specific way. And so I think for Mahler, it was something that he needed to understand. And we could spend all day psychoanalyzing that if we wanted to. We could get really Freudian with it. I do think that it was just something he needed to understand based on his personal experiences with it. And he did have that hemorrhage, I believe it was 1911, or no, 1901, and then he passed in 1911. But he came very close to death a few times. So I think it was, yeah, just based on understanding.
So I've always felt that Mahler had no practicing religious beliefs, either Christian or Jewish. That he was basically an agnostic, if not an atheist. His emotional beliefs really had nothing to do with religion, per se.
Right. Yeah, and there's not a whole lot out there on what his practicing religion was. We could call it cultural Christianity if we wanted to. Or cultural Jewishness, exactly. There's not a lot out here that says Mahler went to synagogue on this day, or Mahler did this on this day. We do know that he was at Catholic masses every once in a while for certain events, like Hans von Bülow. He was at the funeral for that, and so different events like that. We do know that there were things like that. But yeah, that is certainly a way to read it. And that adds another layer of complexity to it, right? So what does cultural Jewishness mean versus religious Jewishness? And where is the line and the distinction? I think that cultural Jewishness plays a large role in how one goes forth, especially when you come from a large Jewish family and when you come from a family who is ingrained in their Jewish community. Cultural Jewishness becomes a large part of your own identity and your own lifestyle. And cultural Christianity would be the same. So I think Mahler was carrying a bit of both as he went forth.
I just have a comment. And so, because one thing I always think about, I sort of feel that Mahler, I think of him as just kind of someone who was spiritual and interested in spiritual things, but kind of very open-minded.
Mm-hmm.
So I always think of thus Liebhunde Erde and the 9th and the 10th, because losing his child,
Mm-hmm.
and sent him into this place where he got a Chinese text.
Mm-hmm.
He composed a piece that sounds German and Chinese at the same time, and all three of those words, it just kind of dies away. It just kind of flows. And I think part of that was he just sort of thought, I just want to let go.
Yeah.
I just want to let go. I don't want to fight it anymore. And so that's, I think he's all of those things, and I don't think it ever bothered him. It bothered everyone else. but yeah, I just think that's another extraordinary thing about him, is that he was open.
Right.
He was open, and I think he was welcoming things in.
Right.
And I don't know, I don't think he complained much
Yeah.
about the stuff that people said.
Yeah.
So.
And it is interesting because Bernstein also was like battle versus East and West in the Young People's Concert. And, as we saw in the critical reception, that battle idea is still there. And if Mahler didn't really think of it as a battle, that becomes a whole nother layer of how the critical reception landscape was changed by all of this early critical reception. Yeah.
Apparently he never complained, but there is that famous quote, "I'm thrice homeless."
Yes. Although Alma's the one that quotes that quote.
Okay.
Yeah.
That makes it kind of suspicious for some of us. But it is a great line. Yeah.
Alma,
I'm not saying it's not true.
yeah.
But anyway, there is some question about whether he actually said that.
Yeah.
Alma said it.
Alma. Any other questions? Comments? Thank you all so much.